Chapter 24. The Cursed Man. Perhaps you are confused at why I should, your humble storyteller, would make such a fuss about this. Tress stopped, wondered if she'd jumped to a conclusion, and then decided to reconsider. Nothing special, right? Wrong. So very soul-crushingly wrong. World bringers like myself spend decades combing through folk tales, legends, myths, histories, and drunken bar songs looking for the most unique stories. We hunt for bravery, cleverness, heroism, and we find no shortage of such virtues. Legends are silly with them. But the person who's willing to reconsider their assumptions, the hero who can sit down and reevaluate their life, well, now that is a gemstone that truly glitters, friend. Perhaps you would prefer a story about someone facing a dragon. Well, this isn't that kind of story, which makes it even more remarkable that Tress does that eventually. But kindly stop getting ahead of me. I can understand why you would want tales of people like Linji, who tried to sail around the world with no aviar. I, however, would trade a dozen Linjis for one person who was willing to sit down for a single blasted minute and think about what they're doing. Do you know how many wars could have been prevented if just one person in charge had stopped to think, maybe we should double check. Perhaps blinking twice isn't an insult in their culture. Do you know how many grand romances would have been could have avoided tragedy if the hero had thought, maybe I should ask her if she likes me first. Do you know how many protracted adventures might have been shortened if the heroine had stopped to wonder, maybe I should look extra carefully to see if the thing I'm searching for has been with me the entire time? I'm drowning in bravery, cleverness, and heroism. Instead, kindly give me just a little common sense. At that moment, Tress was downright majestic. I need more information, Tress thought. Before I decide that I know what the captain's plan is, I need to find a way to spy on her. Maybe I can use Huck again. She nodded, and in that moment, Tress saved herself a huge amount of trouble. The captain's plan had nothing to do with the sorceress after all, but everything to do with why the crew were so frightened of her. Tress picked up her sack, pretending it wasn't full of cannonballs, which was as hard as it sounded, and carried it to the aft cannon, which was set up on the quarterdeck. She performed a similar swap there, placing the cannonball she took into a separate bag within her larger one, while counting Zephyr Spore charges. Then she hauled her bag below decks, where she stowed it in her room. From there, she went looking for me. Now, normally this also would have been a shining example of common sense on her part. Everyone can use a little more wit in their lives, except me. I could stand to lose a pound or two. Unfortunately, I wasn't exactly in the best state of mind during this voyage. She found me playing cards with a group of the Dugs. I was wearing a shoe around my neck, tied by the laces, as I decided it was certain to be the absolute soul of fashion in the following season. I'd forgotten to wear pants, as one does, and my underclothing needed a good washing. Actually, all of me did. I was trying to play a game I'd invented called Kings, where everyone held their cards backwards, so you didn't know what you had, but everyone else did. I can imagine several interesting applications now, but back then, the only interesting part was how easily the Dugs won my wages off of me, followed by my shoe. I still have no idea what I did with the other one. Once the Dugs were finished taking me for what little I was worth, they scrambled off to find some other victim. I sat there wondering if perhaps I should start wearing a sock around my neck until Tress settled down beside me. Would you like to play Kings? I asked with a grin. I still have some undershirts I can bet. No thanks, Tress said. Hoyt, I know you visited the sorceress. Do you remember anything about it? Yep, I said. Great. What can you tell me? Can't, I said, tapping my head. Words don't work that way, kiddo. She makes them something else. I don't understand, Tress said. Neither do I replied. That's the problem. Can't say anything at all about what you might think. It's I shrugged, unable to form the word. Your curse forbids you to talk from talking about your curse, Tress guessed. I winked, mostly because I had something in my eye, but in this case, Tress had guessed correctly. The sorceress was quite specific with each ease. If you tried to talk about it, you'd stutter or the words would die halfway out of your lips. You couldn't even tell people you were cursed unless they already knew. So, Tress said, if I want you to lead me to the sorceress, I have to find a way to break your curse without knowing anything about it. Plus, I have to do that without any help from you whatsoever. I took her hands in mine. I looked into her eyes. I took a deep breath, trembling. I once ate an entire watermelon in one sitting, I told her, and it gave me diarrhea. Tress sighed, pulling her hands free. Right. I guess finding a way to break your curse is slightly less impossible than finding my way to the sorceress on my own. That's something, at least. There was still a part of me deep down that knew what was going on. The sorceress was cruel like that. Sure, turning a man into a simpleton is fun, but true torture lies in letting him remain just aware enough to be horrified. That sensate part of me scrambled to find some way to help. Ulam had been useless, of course. That's the problem with immortals. They get used to sitting around waiting for problems to work themselves out. But here was someone willing to help. What could I say? What could I do? Only a sliver of me was still awake, and it had almost no control. Plus, every time I tried to say anything about my specific predicament, the curse would activate, driving me back and prompting me to do something monstrous, like wear socks with sandals. That glimmer of awareness started to fade, and I seized upon that, my own stupidity, the curse, like many magics of its ilk, depending on how the subject thought, on their intent. I could use that. I knew. The spark flared up like a midnight fire as the coals shifted. I reached toward Tress and blanked my mind as I forced out a string of words. Listen, this is important, I said. I promise you must bring me to your planet, Tress. Repeat that. Bring you to my planet? Yes. If I can save you if you do that. But you're already here. Hear what? I said, having deliberately forgotten what I'd said. Planets don't matter for now. Look for a group of 6 stars, Tress. Tress hesitated. 6 stars? Unfortunately, in that exclamation, my strength was spent. I sat back, adopted a goofy grin, and decided to do some empirical research regarding the flavors of different toads. With a sigh, Tress returned to her quarters. She left the door open for Huck, and so wasn't surprised when she arrived and found whimpering. She burst into the room to find the ship's cat, Knox, crouched and staring under the bed, tail wagging. Tress threw the thing out the door and slammed it, and in the silence that followed, she could distinctly make out the sounds of a hyperventilating rat. Huck? She asked, getting down on her hands and knees, peering beneath the bed. She made him out in the corner, squeezed him into the space between the wood of the bed's leg and the wall. As he saw her, he came timidly toward her, and she scooped him up, feeling him tremble in her hands. It's gone, she said. I'm sorry, Huck. He didn't speak, a rare occasion where he seemed completely without breath or words. He just cringed there in her hands, looking more, well, like a rat than he ever had before. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. Perhaps you can leave the door locked from now on? There's a crack in the floor, and I can squeeze in that way after climbing up the post in the hallway below. All right, Tress said. Are you going to be okay? Huck glanced at the door. Yeah, sure, he whispered. Give me a little time. I still can't believe they got a cat. You're intelligent, Huck, Tress said. You can handle a common cat. Sure, yeah, no problem, Tress. I don't know. It's always watching, prowling. Cats are supposed to sleep 26 hours a day. How can I use my intelligence? How can I plan knowing it's watching? After a few minutes, he seemed to relax. He nodded to her, so she set him on the footboard, then lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, which was the upper deck of the ship. She could hear sailors crossing it, feet thumping, wood creaking as the ship rocked, spores made of constant low hushed sound as they scraped past, like a whisper. Someone had carved parts of the ceiling with a knife, crude little patterns of crossing lines. I hope your day is better than mine, Huck said, perched on the footboard of the bed. The entire thing had a nice railing to keep her from rolling out as the ship swayed. It's been somewhat frustrating, Tress said, but not life-threatening. What she wanted wasn't nearly so important as what she needed, and she felt guilty for focusing on herself. Your problem with the cat is more pressing. Maybe we could keep it extra well fed so it doesn't want to hunt you? Cats don't stop hunting because they're full, Tress. They're like people in that regard. Sorry, she said. We don't have cats on the rock. Sounds like a wonderful place. It was sweet and tranquil, she said. And though the smog above town is pretty terrible, people tend to treat one another well. It's a good place, an honest place. I'd like to go there someday. I know you're thirsty for adventure, but I've had plenty. You could go, Tress said. You don't need to stay with me, Huck. Tired of me already? What? She said, sitting up. That's not what I meant. You're too polite, girl, he said, twitching his nose. I'll assume that you know less about rats than you do about cats. Try to imagine what it's like to be roughly the size of a sandwich and have most of the world consider you as tasty as one. Trust me, you don't want what I have, which is find a sympathetic human and stick close to them, Huck said. Besides, I have a good feeling about you, remember? But you've got to have family somewhere. Yeah, but they don't care much for me, he said. Are they like you? You mean, can they talk? Huck said. Yes, he paused for his head cocked as if searching for the right way to explain. I come from a place a lot like the one you came from. My kind has lived there for generations. But my kin, they thought it was time to go, see the world. They dragged me off for my own good. That didn't go well. They wouldn't much like me hanging around with you. I'm not supposed to talk to your kind. See, still, like I said, I've got a good feeling about you, and so I'm staying close. But I certainly wouldn't mind if you decided of your own free will to head someplace less exciting. Tress tried to imagine it, a land full of talking rats. It sounded exotic and interesting. The 12 Seas were a strange and incredible place full of wonders. Huck kept talking, telling her about life as a rat, and there was a calming sense into his voice. It soothed her, and she found herself relaxing, her eyes tracking the carvings on the ceiling. Someone, perhaps her predecessor, had taken a lot of time to carve them. In fact, did those bursts of crossing lines look like stars? Tress sat up, cutting off Huck. He scampered along the bed, railing over to beside her. What? Stars, carved in little bursts. A single star there, then two stars close together next to it, then three, all across the wood on the ceiling, as if someone had stood on the bed with a knife and used a point to scrape them. No groupings of 6 stars, she thought. What? Huck said. What are you staring at? Nothing, Tress said, flopping back down. I thought for a moment that Hoyt had said something important. You've been listening to him? Tress thought, I thought you were smart for a human. Hoyt is, you know. He said something about 6 stars, Tress said, but there are no bunches of 6. I can see that, Huck said. I told you he's a lunatic, Tress. No use in trying to figure out what he means. I suppose, she said. Besides, Huck noted, those look More like explosions. The stars are under the bed. Tress froze and then leaped off the bed and pulled herself underneath. The bottom of the bed frame was carved as well, with patterns that were indeed more star-like. There was one patch of 6 stars. Feeling like she might be submitting to lunacy herself, Tress pushed it. Something clicked, and a small latch opened on the other side of the frame. Inside, Tress found a small aluminum container the size of a matchbox. Huck climbed onto her shoulder as she pushed it open, and in it she found midnight black spores. And that's the end of chapter 25. I meant chapter 24. This is chapter 25, the prey. So, how did I know? Well, I believe you've been told I'm an expert at being places I'm not supposed to be. I have an innate sixth sense for mystery. In my current state, I might have thought the vests with no shirt underneath to be the absolute height of fashion, but I was still fully capable of a little constructive snooping. Tress's breath caught. Huck hissed softly. Midnight spores. Somehow Weave had gotten a hold of midnight spores. She was reminded of what the captain had said, that all sprouters were to one extent or another crazy. Weave, she thought, might have been a little extra so. Tress was being generous. I'd have called him crazier than a nitroglycerin smoothie. Put those away, Huck said. No better spread them over silver. Kill them, Tress. Midnight spores are dangerous. In what way? She asked. What do they do? Terrible things. All spores do terrible things, Tress said. What do these do specifically? I don't know, Huck admitted, but I feel like you're way too relaxed about holding them. Perhaps she was, but danger is like icy water. You can get used to it if you take it slowly. She tucked the little box of spores safely back in its hidden compartment. She'd have to see if Ulam knew. She jumped as the bell rang up above. 3 quick peals, a warning to everyone on board. A ship had been spotted in the distance, and the captain had decided to pursue. Tress scrambled out of her room, but then stood in the hallway, not wanting to crowd the Duggs as they hastened to the top deck. It was excruciating to wait, and she didn't want to miss anything. She needn't have worried. When she finally reached the deck, she found the Duggs clustered anxiously near the railing, looking out at a distant ship. As usual, the crow's song flew a royal merchant's flag. They wouldn't announce their pirate nature until the proper dramatic moment. Like the third act twist of a play, only with the added bonus of grand larceny. What followed was an extended chase that took 5 hours. The crow's song was faster than most ships, particularly after it dropped the ballast it used to sit lower in the spores, mimicking a merchant ship fully laden with goods in the hold. But speed is a relative term at sea, particularly the spore sea, when the seethe could stop or start at any moment. Tress hadn't realized how unusual it had been for her first vessel to be caught by surprise. The second pursuit required exacting work from the crew and the helmswoman, who slowly but surely ran down their prey. The hours made Tress's tension mount. This was it, the final test of her plan to swap the cannonballs. She grew increasingly certain she had failed. Surely someone had discovered what she'd done. Surely she wasn't clever enough to trick seasoned killers like Laggart and the captain. Her heart nearly leapt from her chest when Crow shouted the order. Forward cannon to bear! All sailors, take arms! The Duggs ran for their muskets, though the ship they were chasing was still far away. Tress didn't try to arm herself. Considering how she'd fired a musket precisely 0 times in her life, she figured the best way to keep her digits attached was to continue that perfect record. She did, however, position herself near the prow where she could witness Anne begging Laggart to let her have the first shot. He chewed her out and sent her to stand with the others, where one of the Duggs pointedly took the pistol from her hand and put a cutlass in it instead. Anne had another pistol out a moment later, slipped from her holster on the back of her belt. "Warning shot, cannon master!" Crow shouted. Tress held her breath. Laggert swiveled the cannon with a crank, then sighted with his spyglass before using another level to raise the cannon's barrel a few inches. He continued this process, exacting the precise, making adjustments. Finally, he pulled a wet firing stick from the bucket of water at his station. He touched it to the firing pin, setting off the zephyr spores with a raucous explosion. The ball soared directly at the fleeing ship. There was no warning shot. This would be another accidental direct hit, intended to sink, not frighten. Tress heard Anne mutter nearby as she watched the cannonball's trajectory. Tress steeled herself, her panic mounting as she thought of the poor sailors on that ship. Then, with what seemed like only moments to spare, the cannonball exploded, set to detonate like a mortar. It sprayed water across the side of the prey ship, but left the hull unharmed. The sea's response was, of course, immediate. Enormous tentacles of vines erupted from the spore sea, wrapped around the wet side of the ship, gripping the vessel in its deadly embrace. Even from a distance, Tress was certain she could hear the planks groaning, but the ship's hull did not crack. The precision shot immobilized the ship instead of destroying it. Though the crew cheered, this meant easy plunder. Laggert cursed softly, his face growing red. The shade of a forge, the moment before you remove the iron, and produced to lay it into it with everything you have, proceeded to lay into it with everything you have. Captain Crow marched across the deck to the cannon station. Her glare would have skinned a cat, but out loud she said, "Not exactly what I would call a warning shot, Cannon Master, but that was a very clean capture." "Thank you, Captain," Laggert said. "I apologize for failing in your request." He punctuated each syllable as if he were whipping the sounds for coming from his lips. Tress nearly started hyperventilating from the anxiety. Was Laggert looking at her with a more surly than normal expression? Did he know? If he only suspected foul play, there was only one rational culprit. The captain seemed like she wanted to order another shot, but then she glanced at the cheering Dugs. Even in the twisted lump of smoldering coal that was her heart, Crow understood she needed good morale on her vessel. A quick and easy haul here would accomplish that. "Run up the pirate's flag, Seaman Doug," she said. In response, their prey fired a flare bright in the air. "Surrender." The Dugs cheered again. Tress started to calm down. It was working. Unfortunately, as the Crow's song drew close to the captive ship, the seas stilled. The Crow's song lurched to a halt, and this instantly dampened everyone's enthusiasm. Tress looked at the Dugs, worried. What was the problem? There were interruptions like this every day. "Anne," Tress said, sidling up to her, "what's wrong?" "The ship surrendered," Anne said, her voice tense, "'cause they knew they were beaten. With them held by vines, we could maneuver, and they could not. But now we're both of us stuck. The sea just evened this match, and they got to be asking if maybe they shouldn't just..." She trailed off as a blue puff of zephyr spore rose from the other ship's aft, followed by a crack, followed by a whistle and a crash as a cannonball hit the Crow's song right at the prow where the spores met wood. Chapter 26. The Dugs shouted and went scrambling. Anne cursed something incredibly vile, relating to what comes out of the business end of a seagull. "Damn fine shooting," Laggert muttered. "Hit us first shot. They've got quite the cannon master." Crow shoved aside a few Dugs, then calmly raised her weapon. It looked sleeker than the other muskets the Dugs carried and had a different sight. Though the Crow's song had shortened the distance to the other ship, Tress was still amazed as the captain trained her musket toward the enemy, closed one eye, and fired. A man on the distant ship, the one holding the water firing stick as his assistants reloaded the cannon, dropped in a spray of blood. Well, Lagert said, I guess they had a damn fine cannon master. Carpenter and Sprouter, the captain said loudly as she lowered the musket and began to reload, dropping a small pouch of zephyr spores down the muzzle. We've been hit. When the sea comes again, we'll scoop up half the sea and everyone on this ship will find out what spores taste like. Perhaps you'd like to do your jobs and prevent that? Right, Captain, Anne said, raising her pistol. Let me just get off one more shot before at least a half dozen Dougs grabbed her arm, rustling for the pistol. The captain ignored them, sighting once again, then dropped the sailor who'd been hefting the cannonball to load into the enemy's cannon. It was the best shooting Tress had ever seen. It was the only shooting, granted. Nevertheless, I'll admit Crow was one of the best shots I'd ever seen. And considering that primitive muskets handled like a snake being electrocuted, that is saying something. To work, Anne, the captain said, calm, yet somehow threatening, ice crushing in her voice, or my next shot won't have to travel to another ship. Moon shadows, Anne said, stumbling over Tress. Those Dougs really wanted a chance to use my pistol, eh? Well, let's be on with the captain's order. Stop delaying, Tress. She scrambled below decks, Tress following. You have your tools? Anne asked as they reached the middle deck. What tools? Tress asked. Anne, I only became ship sprouter this morning. I have no idea what I'm doing. Right, Anne said, wiping her brow. Okay. Above, a cannon shot sounded from their ship. We need rose spores. There should be a whole bunch of them in Weave's room. Tress nodded. She leaned to Anne, led Anne to the room though the carpenter hesitated at the threshold. Tress continued inside, then pried off the top of a small barrel full of rose spores. Get some of those, Anne said, and put them in one of the metal boxes, the kind you can transport spores in. Yeah, that. I saw Weave use some other equipment, too. I don't really know a lot about this kid. Tress finished filling the metal box with spores. Then she pulled open the closet, revealing an array of metal tools hanging from pegs on the inside of the door. She didn't see anything like the box the Sprouter had used on the other ship. Weave, it should be noted, was a purist. He preferred the classical tools of the trade, not the modern ones. Any of these look right? Tress asked. Oh, Anne said, the one with the flat side like a plate and the trowel. Grab those. The second tool did indeed look like a small shovel, but the first one looked like less like a plate to Tress and more like a shield. A little round shield flat on the front with a handle on the back to hold it. The tools had clips on them from hanging from the belt, but there wasn't time for that. Tress gathered them up along with the spores and an eyedropper bottle of water and stumbled out to meet Anne, who backed away, hands up. Righty-o, Anne said. Normally I'd let the Sprouter handle the initial patch while I gathered lumber, but I think maybe you could use a little help, eh? Thanks, Tress said, letting Anne lead the way down the hold. Bright sunlight bathed the normally dim confines, shining through the hole near the ceiling. The hold was taller than the other decks, putting the hole some 9 feet up in the air. I'll get a ladder, Anne said. So what you need to do is grow some spores in that hole, and it don't have to be pretty. I'll do the pretty part with the wood over the next few days. We just need the hole filled. Rosite is good at resisting silver and can last quite a while once it's in place, so it makes a great plug, assuming, you don't kill yourself first. Any advice on avoiding that last part? Tress asked, her voice growing more shrill. Which I did, kid. Those are all the right 2 tools, but I've stayed real far away whenever Weave broke out the spores. That guy was nuttier than squirrel droppings, no offense. Anne set up with a ladder, then backed away. She didn't offer any further help, but Tress was thankful nonetheless. She climbed to the top of the ladder and looked out the ocean of spores. At that moment, they were calm, flat, stable. But the instant the seeds started, the ship would move forward and the verdant spores would come flooding through the gap. Even if the hold had a silver lining, the ship would quickly take on way too much weight and stop floating. Tress didn't hear any more shots from above. She pretended that was a good sign, and she set her equipment on a nearby shelf for sacks. Last of all, she opened the aluminum box of spores. They looked like grains of pink salt. Trembling, she tipped the box until a few of them dribbled out onto the edge of the broken wood. Unfortunately, by the time she had the dropper open and the water ready to squirt, the spores had turned dark gray, dead from the silver on the deck just above. Feeling stupid, she closed the box, but not before a number of those inside had died also. She took a few deep breaths, then forcing herself to keep trying, she put some water on the wood first, then opened the box. Leaning back and shielding her face, she sprinkled a few spores onto the water. It was a commendable execution of a terrible plan. The rose spores broke into thick roseite crystals like big chunks of quartz. While they weren't sharp, some broke up into the ceiling and another shot diagonally past Tress's head, nearly smashing her in the face. It didn't plug the hole. The crystals left far too much space between them, and their weight caused them to rip off the wood and tumble down, half out into the sea, half down to the bottom of the hold. Tress gasped belatedly. "Tress," Anne said, "be careful." Moon shadows, what was she doing? The entire ship was depending on her, but she knew about as much about this as she did weaponized vexology. Watch out for that solid-colored flags. They'll get you. You saw that sprouter on the Oot stream, she reminded herself. He sealed the hole. The tools were different, but you know what the patch is supposed to look like. As she fumbled with the tool, she noticed something. The rosite was still growing. When the large crystals had broken free, they left small bits attached to the hole, and those touching the water were expanding slowly like creeping mold. Did the same thing happen with verdant spores? Did the vines keep growing if you added more water? She didn't know. But she added some water to the growing rosite spores, and yes, although the growth was slow, they did continue to expand. Far too slowly to fill the hole, she thought. Still, like the proverbial politician in a dumpster, it was a good start. She took a tool that resembled the shield and pressed it to the rosite. The crystals responded immediately, pulling toward the metal, which, from the slate gray color, seemed to be simple iron. The other tool, the trowel, made the crystals grow away from it. It was polished silvery metal. Still, for those who compulsively track these things. Right, so each tool influenced the growth of spores. That made sense. Perhaps a low rumbling noise came from outside the hull, a reverberating horror, the sound of spores churning. The seed was back again. "Tress!" Anne shouted. No time for contemplation. If those spores flooded in, Tress would be the first to go. She took the shield tool in her left hand and pressed it into the hole. With her other hand, she grabbed a tiny pinch of 2 or 3 spores. No time to worry if her hands were dry enough, and she dropped them into the water on the rim of the broken wood. They exploded, but they were pulled to the shield, and it prevented them from going unexpected directions. The force of it did nearly shove her off the ladder. Anne cried and grabbed the base of it to steady her, which helped. As rosite crystals began to grow around the edges of the shield, Tress grabbed the trowel and pushed them away. She was able to angle them to grow toward the sides of the hole, like using mortar that grew as she directed. Winds in the sail made the ship rock backward, lifting the prow. Tress barely got the crystals to seal the final edge of the hole as the ship, crashing forward, her plug stood and shook and cracked. There had been water on the other edge, but the vines that grew because of it didn't break through, and there wasn't enough water for them to grow big enough to trap the ship. The moment stretched, pulled taut with anxiety, trembling and holding its breath. The patch held. "Oh, Moons," Anne said, "you actually did it. Can you maybe put another layer on, or—" "Let's not tempt fate," Tress said, trying to pull her shield tool free. It was overgrown with the rosite and affixed in place. "I'll probably need a silver knife to cut this off. Maybe we should try that when we're docked someplace safe." "Yeah, all right," Anne said, holding the ladder as Tress climbed down. "I'm just glad you were here. Until you took the job, it would have made my been my duty to patch that, I would have used wood, and that pause in the seethe was short enough that I wouldn't have had nearly enough time. Another crack sounded above. Gunfire. This isn't over yet, Anne said. Merciful moons, I hope that patch holds on. Come on. And that's the end of chapter 26. Chapter 27. The Spore Eater. Tress made a brief stop in her room to stow the box of spores and her remaining tool, reassuring Huck, who was hiding under the bed again, then hurried up the steps. By the time she arrived, the crow's song was getting dangerously close to their target. 3 bodies lay bleeding on the deck of the merchant ship. The rest of the crew held up their arms, no visible weapons drawn. It looked like Laggert had tried another cannon shot because another burst of vines covered the ship's aft section, many of them overgrowing the enemy's cannon. Another of Tress's swapped cannonballs had exploded instead of sinking the ship, but it might not be enough. The merchant vessel had given Crow plenty of excuses to be angry. Tress worried she would order the crew to slaughter everyone aboard that poor vessel. The pirates would have their treasure now, and Crow would have her reputation as a dead runner. As the crow's song slowed, several dogs threw hooks with ropes over the merchant vessel. Another dropped the anchor. Nervous, Tress looked to the captain, who stood with her musket at the ready. All crew, Crow said. Swords out! Prepare to board! Tress felt a sudden spike of panic. No! After all she'd done to protect those... Captain! A voice called, sharp, commanding. Everyone turned toward the quarterdeck where Sally stood, one hand on the ship's wheel. She locked it in place now that the ship was anchored, then walked to the steps. By tradition, Sally called, the duty to engage the captain of a captured ship falls to me, does it not? The Dugs kept their weapons trained on the merchant vessel, but no one spoke. They knew someone was very likely to be shot in the next few minutes and didn't want it to seem like they were volunteering. Crow turned to face Sally straight on, musket held in a loose grip. The helmswoman did not back down, and Tress found herself praying to the moons. We have subdued them, Sally said loudly. They have surrendered. We've become pirates for the freedom, nothing more. She stood firm, and her posture made her intent clear. She would not stand by and let the merchant crew be slaughtered. If Crow wanted a massacre today, she was going to have to start by killing Sally. Crow could do it, she said. Done it to Weave, but how many crew members could Crow lose and still have a functioning ship? As you say, Crow finally announced, let them know I do not appreciate the bilging my ship received after they sent up a flare of surrender. That sort of indiscretion costs lives. They'll pay more than the normal bounty, Sully said. I'll make sure of it, Captain. Tress let out a held breath. Sailors started moving again, throwing more boarding hooks to keep the ships from drifting apart. Sally was the first to hop over to the merchant ship. Tress sat down on the steps to the quarterdeck, worn out, and now feeling like a wash rag you'd find at the very bottom of the bin, the one that had been wadded up and pressed flat for weeks by the pile. A shadow fell over her. We didn't sink, Crow said. That means you did your job. Tress nodded. She was great, Captain, Anne said from behind. A natural, I'd say. Sealed that hole on her second try. Barely seemed terrified by the spores. Indeed, Crow said, her expression unreadable as she continued to look at Tress. Anne, don't you think you should be fitting planks? In case this expert work by our new sprouter isn't as durable as it might seem? I suppose. She moved off. Anne, the captain said, holding her hand out. Anne sighed and handed over a pistol she'd found somewhere, then vanished below decks. Crow moved over to watch the ship as the Dugs began appearing from its hold, bearing rolled rugs, the ship's cargo. A group of merchant sailors huddled on deck where their captain spoke softly with Sally. He had a squeezed face with too much forehead and chin. Like You were seeing it reflected in a spoon. Everyone had calmed down save one man, a sailor who knelt on the deck apart from the others. Something about his posture bothered Tress, so she climbed the steps to get a better look through the overgrown vines. Yes, the man was cradling a corpse of one of the people Crow had shot. A friend? Family member? The weeping man looked up, reckless, dangerous. Tress opened her mouth to call out a warning, but the man lurched to his feet and pulled a pistol from his belt. With a quivering hand, he pointed it across the gap between the ships toward Crow. Again, everyone froze. Everyone but Captain Crow herself. She stared down the barrel with indifference. Smoke! The merchant captain yelled. Don't be a lunatic, man! You'll get us all killed! The man, Schmoke, stood up, stained with his friend's blood, but didn't lower the gun. He also didn't pull the trigger. Captain Crow raised the pistol she'd taken off Anne and pointed it at the man. Then Crow turned the pistol around and shot herself in the head. Immediately, vines erupted from Crow's skin. They split her cheek and wormed around her eyes, writhing and twisting. One caught the bullet. The skin of her face and hand rippled as if she had serpents for muscles. The vines wiggled, and then withdrew, slithering back into her body. A drop of blood leaked from the corner of Crow's eye, and a bit more seeped from a rip in her cheek, but otherwise her face appeared untouched. She lowered the pistol and then took a long pull off of her canteen. Finally, she waved Smoke forward as if demanding he try shooting her too. Several of his crew members tackled him, and then the shot went off in the air. I expect my ship to sail under an hour, Crow said loudly, laden with more riches than she should rightly carry. Her eyes lingered on the other ship's captain, who still stood near Saleh. If it is not done, I will visit your fine vessel and teach each and every one of you what it means to cross Captain Crow. If you doubt my sincerity, ask the crew of the Ott's Dream how much they're enjoying life at the bottom of the verdant sea. The captain disappeared into her cabin. Tress slumped onto the steps again, trembling, burdened by the terrible sight of those vines bursting from Captain Crow's body. What was she? And that's the end of the first part of chapter 4.